Cool. Well, Steve, thanks for joining me a second time. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me. I hope things are going well for you over there
Yeah.
on the other side of the pond.
Yes. The last time we talked, I was in Bali, and this was during the pandemic. And
Hmm.
I remember I was right next to the ocean, and I had that conversation with you about you being adrift for 76 days at sea, and just walking out, looking at the ocean. It was a very profound uh, conversation, and I urge everyone to go back and listen to that if they haven't to already. But one of the things we didn't talk about as much last time is like you've lived a long life, obviously, apart from these 76 days. And I
Right.
was kind of hoping to get a little insight into how um, perhaps you've integrated this amazing survival experience throughout decades of your life, because it has come up with your work on movies and etc., your books. Anyway, I'm going on far too long. What I really wanted to know is, first off, how old were you when you this the days adrift happened?
I turned 30 in the life raft, a couple of days in the life raft. It wasn't exactly one of my best birthdays.
Wow.
Um, I'm 69 now. I'll be 70 next year, and I guess it'll be the 40th anniversary of actually being adrift. So yeah, it's amazing to me how life is composed of moments, really, or short periods of time that are important experiences in our life, and and how they can live on. Because certainly I've lived adrift for a very long time in many, many, many different ways. Really, in fact, this just came up this week because we sold film rights to the book way long time ago, and that's a very convoluted story in its own right. And of course, most of these stories never actually get made into film. But there is a filmmaker in California who's actually producing a documentary of Adrift. He's got all my, he came here for a week with a sound and lighting guy, and they filmed a lot. The memorabilia that I had left. I read bits of the log, which I hadn't looked at in almost 40 years.
Yeah.
Um, and all of that. And so it came up because they're like all, especially documentary filmmakers, kind of hand to mouth. They're usually labors of love. I've been involved with a few. Usually they take years and years and years of incredible dedication and work to accomplish. And of course, they're always looking for money, but it's coming together slowly but surely. And I try the best I can to be supportive of this, but I had to point out to those guys, I've been living adrift now for almost 40 years, and it comes up virtually every day. It is incredible to me. I get emails from people, or something like talking to somebody for a podcast, or requests for podcasts, or other kind of interviews, going out and talking. But before COVID anyway, I would occasionally go out and do talks for nonprofits and stuff, especially in recent years. All of that. So it really was like writing Adrift was like almost like having a child. And once it gets published, it's like, well, you're shoving them out of the nest and they go off and have a life of their own. And it's had quite a life. I am surprised. I think the I was so naive when I was 30 in writing this, um, because I think I had the idea that if I wrote a book about it, it would answer everybody's questions. Wrong.
Yeah.
Just kind of stirs everything up again. But it's been an incredibly, sometimes tiring, but also incredibly positive experience overall. It's taken me really all over the world. Not that I wasn't zooming around the world with other parts of my professional career and whatnot, but it really has taken me all over the world and introduced me to incredible people. I've gotten to meet, people like Thor Heyerdahl, author of Kon-Tiki, a great adventure of my youth, especially.
Mm.
Very inspiring character. All kinds of other survivors and whatnot. And as you mentioned, also even working on a couple of feature films. So that it's been very interesting how the serendipity of my life has has steered me.
Well, it's interesting when you say it comes up every day, and it almost, not to compare these two experiences, totally, but someone like Paul McCartney is always going to be a Beatle for the rest of his life. It's like, okay, it's
Right.
decades ago, but it's brought up every day. And for you, I mean, how do you feel about that? Is that something that, does it feel like a burden?
I have to be completely honest. I have very mixed feelings about it. For one thing, it's made me very empathetic for people who are actually famous.
Yeah.
The old joke, I'm famous, it's just nobody knows it yet. And for somebody like Paul McCartney, especially, I for the little bit of fame that I've had, um, it can be overwhelming at times, and so I have great empathy for that mixed blessing of fame, of real fame, like somebody like Paul McCartney, because it's incredible pressure. And the disappearance of a certain amount of privacy and things like that. It's, even for me, has kind of spun out of control at times. Way back when in the 80s, after I'd come back from this experience, I got quite burned out from and the first year back. I mean, here I was, kind of a single-handed sailor. I was pretty introverted generally, um, and I came back to a lot of hoopla, and I wanted to talk about it. It was an important experience to me, and what I thought was a valuable experience, and I wanted to share that with people. I've always felt that the experience itself is way bigger than me. I think I may have told you this in our last discussion. For me, I was like the clumsy, very flawed human observer of this incredible world that I somehow was a tiny cog in that machine, and was blessed to be able to witness it. And so I've always felt the responsibility to the story, if you will, and all of that. But after I got back, I was, getting calls from people all over the world, newspapers and whatnot, and there was a lot of pressure that came from that, and not just pressure, but really weird things that would happen.
Like what?
It's There was a kind of very uncomfortable period with the Coast Guard. The people that interview me, and then they're calling back and they're going, "Well, this guy in the Coast Guard's telling me that this is all a fraud and blah blah blah," which has happened to a number of survivors I've known. Actually, it's one thing that's made me very sympathetic to their situation, and actually helped inspire me to write a book called Capsized, about four guys who were on a boat that turned upside down and spent 4 months in this half flooded
Wow.
boat off in New Zealand during the winter in the Southern Hemisphere. Um, and when they got back, everybody said, "Oh, this has got to be a fraud and whatnot." And I've found that that's happened with a number of people, especially ocean survivors, because they're out of sight, out of mind. It's not like, I don't know, somebody who's, dug out of an avalanche and, on land where people know when it happened, how it happened, and all of that. And it was a screw up of communication. And this, frankly, it was a Coast Guard officer who, as I said, was, when survivors have the bad taste to show up alive after everybody's written them off,
Yeah.
it can be embarrassing for certain individuals, especially people involved with search and rescue and things like that. And that's it's kind of a hammer, frankly, for to the head of survivors, because not only do we have to go through the experience, but then we come back to people who are, trying to kind of badmouth you. There are things like that. There was a situation back in the heyday of magazines, if anybody remembers what a magazine is,
Yes.
one of the world's biggest magazines was Reader's Digest, and they did a big feature on me. Actually, I don't know if you can see it, but I might be able to show you up on the very top.
Oh yeah. For
up
people who are
up
just listening
here
to this,
is
in
illustration out of Reader's Digest.
for
And
people,
when
sorry to interrupt. Just for
Go
people who
ahead.
are only listening to this, the view from Steve's perspective is his study, and it's a lot of paintings and portraiture on the wall. It's very nice looking. Sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
this is my shipwreck corner.
Yeah.
I have many corners of my office, but this is the theme back here. It's a little bit. Most of my memorabilia is at a couple of museums now, but I have a couple of, a few pictures. You can see the spear gun back there I carried right
Oh well.
there. Um, and those are going away soon too. But it's good. I have a block from a wreck off of Bermuda that we dove on, which is a good reminder
Do
of what
you?
can happen out there, that kind of thing.
I'm curious. Do you ever look at this experience that, in a lot of other people's eyes, at least, has come to define you? Do you want them to, if you're gonna be known or famous for anything, do you want to be famous for this?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm not sure if anybody's ever asked me that, which is unusual. um, um, I don't really know, and I'm like I said, I feel like my life has been controlled by serendipity. My philosophy of life is don't fight upstream so much, float downstream and avoid as many rocks as possible because it's still quite the ride. Um, and that served me well because it's taken me all these different directions, and I feel very fulfilled from my life. What other people think about it really is not as important to me. I guess it is to everybody to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I don't want to be remembered as a complete idiot.
Yeah.
But uh, I don't know. I've done a lot of things in my life, and in fact, one of the things I'm kind of most proud of is I feel like I've been a catalyst in my life. I've worked with a lot of people um, to help create things that are much bigger than myself. Even though I've worked a lot alone, I've sailed a lot alone, and so on. I've brought those experiences into things like working on Life of Pi, for example, which brought a lot of the story of Adrift to completely new audiences and in a completely different format. And I that to create something like any film really demands the talents of a huge number of people, and almost everybody I worked with on Life of Pi were incredibly talented, dedicated people who brought their A game. And if any one of them had fallen down on the job, it wouldn't have worked. So I'm very proud of those kinds of contributions, even though 20 years from now nobody may know that I had any part in that at all. That doesn't really matter. It's what comes out the other end instead. And I spent a lot of my life as a maritime journalist, primarily maritime, in interviewing people and you know um, writing articles about people whose work I really respected and who I thought really add something to the world. And so I'm kind of proud of that. And I know a lot of things that I've done have led to connections with people that have gone off and done something else too. And that's how our lives are. We're not even aware of everybody we touch in our life. So um, I guess I don't need to be remembered for anything, but in my head, that body of work that I've created, whether it's drawing or contributing to um, a survival manual or lecturing or something, if that has any kind of positive outcome in the long run, whether I know it or not, even myself. I feel at ease with what I've done overall, and whether or not a drift had ever happened to me, I think I would have been okay. If that answers
Yeah.
your question at all.
No, absolutely. And I was just curious because that is a it's definitely an unusual thing to be known for, you know. Um,
Yeah.
and because most people have not gone through this kind of experience. But I think part of the reason why they're so fascinated by it is because it is such a survival story, and it feels like it taps into something just very basic in human nature that we don't really encounter in this much more comfortable, safe world, at least
Yeah.
in the West.
Yeah, I think that, this guy I was talking about who was working on this documentary film said the other day something about, my contribution to the film, and they want the secret sauce. What's the secret sauce of the drift? And
Yes.
I think the real secret sauce is there, if there is one, um, is that I came back from a situation that, in specific ways, is pretty unique. It's a pretty small club of long-term ocean survivors out there, and I've met a few of them. Most of them are gone now, unfortunately. People like Maurice and Marilyn Bailey, who I think were incredible people, and Dougal Robertson. I don't know what's happened to his family, but Dougal I know is gone. Um, People like that, and um, really, it's very rare, especially these days with the kind of communications we have and stuff. I was operating in the relative Stone Age, but so it's a unique situation. So there's that, call of adventure, if you will, especially to a lot of younger people. A lot of schools were using it in Adrift as to accompany various kinds of lessons in grade school. Kids as young as 10 years old were reading it. Some of them, making really um, intelligent observations about my situation. Things like that. But at the same time, it's totally universal. We all survive every day. We all struggle with it, or at least the vast majority of us, whether it's struggling to get through school or struggling with living in a domestic abuse situation, or the survival writ large covers a pretty wide territory. So I've once I even before Adrift was published, but especially after Adrift was published, I get constant communication. I've gotten constant communication from people who've never even seen the ocean, have no experience with boats or sailing or any of those things, but have written to me about their own struggles, which I find quite touching. I've had, complete strangers share with me very intimate elements of their life, and it's very, it's incredibly touching that people would feel open enough with me to be able to do that, because somehow I spoke to them through Adrift in ways that they could relate to, even though it was very unique.
Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting about you was that you seemed, if you could, you seem like almost the perfect guy to go through this kind of experience. When we talk about doing yoga and stuff like that, and we talked a little bit about like Zen and stuff like that last time, and your closeness to the natural world. Um, I'm curious, from at least from the vantage point of someone in my generation, that kind of disposition or those interests, specifically things like yoga, it seems like it would be less common from people from your generation. Is that true, or what was your sort of social background to get into that stuff?
Well, well, actually, my generation, you got to remember, we were all old hippies, basically. Not necessarily um, hippies in a strict sense of the world, in that I didn't live in at Haight Ashbury in San Francisco, the real home of hippies. But I was of the 60s generation. We were but I was unusual even then. I mean, I was I was anti-establishment, but anti-establishment. I was a philosophy major. I love ideas, even dumb ideas. It can be fun, but scary also if they get absorbed by too many people. Many of which is the case today about many dumb ideas. But no matter what I've done, my life has been very bifurcated in terms of kind of living in my head. Like I said, I was very introverted, especially as a kid, and felt comfortable being alone, felt comfortable being in wilderness environments, things like that, and doing physical things. Even today, even though I've had a lot of health issues and whatnot, I feel, I guess light dawned on Marblehead eventually, and I've realized that I really like just like being outside and being, looking at the stars and the woods and, all that kind of stuff and doing physical things. Um, but at the same time, I like the heady stuff. I like the ideas. I like science. Even what I did for work. I started building boats, and then I got into design and teaching design, which got me more into writing and communications and things like that. And through all the years, I had a mix. I would go off doing a voyage, but then I would also write articles about it. So I guess my life has been unusual in that way. I've had a couple of real jobs in my life, so to speak, but mostly I work for myself and direction myself. But doing things like yoga, for example, was completely common in my generation. My generation, and actually starting really with the beatnik generation, was opening up America to new ideas and to new ways of thinking. I actually knew a guy who stayed in Japan after the war and studied Zen Buddhism, and colleagues of his were people like Alan Watts. Were bringing these ideas to America back when I was young. I mean, I was living aboard the first boat I lived aboard. I was reading Alan Watts, and when I was in college, I was reading all kinds of philosophy, Eastern philosophy, Hinduism, Buddhism, studying history of religion, as well as is other, metaphysics, Kant and all these people. So I'm not sure. It's hard for me to pin myself and whether or anything in any kind of logical way. But I guess to really get to your point, I've always thought that I was kind of like, if somebody's going to get stuck out here, pretty I'm pretty much the guy you want to have, because I had direct experience with using my hands, of patching boats together in various ways, because once you're offshore, you can't just park the boat in the side of the road and, wait for the cop to show up.
Yeah.
You got to rely on yourself. And I had done a number of, pretty radical, sailed a fair number of pretty radical boats for their era. And usually if you're doing those sorts of things, you have failures and whatnot. And plus you're pushing them a lot of times, especially if you're doing any kind of racing. So I was used to that hands-on. I'm in an isolated environment with limited resources, whether it was at sea or like hiking in the mountains or whatever it was. And how do I solve this problem with what I've got? And so in a practical way, I was pretty well experienced for a person of that age. Plus, I was physically in the best shape of my life, which was important. And then I was also able, in a kind of psychological way, and this I think was kind of essential, at least to myself, and I think to other survivors, is that I don't know, it's not really an out of body experience exactly, but you almost have to be able to separate yourself from that part of you that is suffering, fearful, all those elements. And for me, the basis of that is story. That in our lives, whether we're, doing what you do, um, or working for a big company or whatever, that we have to see a story of our life that has meaning. I don't know if I mentioned before, but one of my favorite books is Viktor Frankl's The Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes.
He was a concentration camp survivor, incredible person, and talk about positive outlook in the world. Oh my God, what he faced, what he witnessed, what he experienced, somehow he put into a context that was really meaningful to himself, and has been meaningful to thousands of people ever since. He's written some great books. And so for me, it was like, I often talk about or ask about, what's the important equipment that you had? Well, I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for the life raft itself, which survived an incredible voyage. Um, I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for the spear gun, which provided me with virtually all of my food. I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for the solar stills, as dysfunctional as they kind of were, but providing me with almost all of my water. I mean, every little element had to line up, of course. So basically, everything is essential, no matter how inconsequential. But if I had to grade things, the other most important element, piece of gear that I had were the pencils and little pads of paper that I carried that allowed me to keep notes and, create a log that allowed me to at least maintain a sort of illusion that I was not, that when I lost my boat, it wasn't the end of the voyage, but was a continuation and a much more humble craft. I still, was able to
Mm.
keep a log, do normal shipboard routine, navigate, keep navigational notes, all those practical things, but also to kind of separate myself from it in a psychological way, so that I could sit there and, yeah, I'm in pain, I'm suffering, this is horrible, blah, blah, blah. But this is what happened with a fish today, and wasn't that just like awesome? And it all boiled down to, in terms of the story, like Kathy, my wife, always says, well, I think the core of your story comes down to a line that you wrote in your log. It's a view of heaven from a seat in hell.
Mm.
That no matter how bad it was, no matter how desperate it was, I could still kind of do that psychological splitting and see that, that this was an incredible experience, and I was awakened to strengths I never knew I had, weaknesses that were highly outlined, and which has been very useful in the rest of my life, and to know both strengths and weaknesses, and to develop this incredible relationship with nature, to feel more connected to everything in the universe in a very visceral way than I had ever felt in my life. So these are things that a lot of survivors see in their experiences. I've a couple of examples of that. Again, Maurice and Marilyn Bailey. Maurice wrote in their book, which has been published in a couple of titles, but 119 Days Adrift and 117 Days Adrift. The last, because it was misreported early on and they didn't want to confuse people when they came out with the book. Anyway, at the end of that, finally somebody sees them and comes to pick them up, and he's got this brilliant passage about, there's this almost reticence to be saved from the situation, because they've completely adapted to it, and they're sort of kings of their domain. And the same thing happened. I did a TV show with some of the crew of an aircraft that crashed into the Andes, that led to the book Alive, and in a movie also by that. And Nando Parada, who was basically credited with sort of leading the group, becoming a de facto leader of the group, and hiking out over the mountains to safety, and bringing rescuers to them. He and I were in the corner of the green room just chatting, which is one of the real treats of having experienced something like this. You get to meet these amazing people. And he says to me, sometimes just wish I was back in the mountains again. And these are people that had to cannibalize the bodies of other passengers, just the most horrendous kind of experience you can imagine. And yet there was a value, a deep spiritual and emotional value to the experience. So I think all of survivors share that. And, keeping a log for me was very important because it allowed me to, I don't know, put on my kind of writer's hat and say, okay, fine, you're over here, but I'm here right now, like I'm interviewing myself,
Yeah.
in about the experience. So that was really, really important. And the arts, I find, are incredibly important to other survivors, especially in the post-trauma period, where we need to make a story for ourselves that means something. In business, we call it self-actualization, where our work isn't just pushing a bolt, but is a contribution to a greater whole that we think is valuable.
Yeah, when you say putting on the captain's hat, I was thinking of someone who's like checking the thermostat in the middle of a fire. Like it does kind of, it's for your own sanity. I imagine that was helpful. But how did you know to do that? Was that a skill you had picked up, or was that your disposition?
Yeah, disposition is learned to a certain degree. We know from survival training, for example, that you can vastly improve people's chances of survival. Um, Early in the survival stage, and anybody who reads Drift knows that I kind of divide myself up conceptually into a physical and an emotional and a rational part. They were like these three people almost in the raft, arguing with each other often because they have very different needs and desires and fears and
Yeah.
all of that. The physical part of me is wanting to eat every fish I possibly can, and the emotional part of me has gotten very attached to the fish, and I look at them as very highly spiritual creatures, and sort of, I don't know, they're really the stars of the show. And I didn't want to really catch any of them, and that rational part would come in and say, well, you fish, but you want to fish in certain times because it's more efficient to fish at certain times, and you can't just like fish all the time because every time you catch a fish, it endangers your equipment. At one point, put a hole in the bottom of the raft, almost killed me, and kept breaking the spear. And I don't know how long I'm going to be out here, so you have to ration your equipment and your time and your energy and all these other things. So, all these different sort of characters within myself come into play. And it's kind of like that all the time. In fact, there was a single-handed single-handed round the world race that started about when I got back, actually. I think it was in 82 that year. And one of these early competitors was talking about, he says, you go offshore as a single-handed sailor, and you're laying in your bunk and all hell's breaking loose up on deck, and you're going, oh my god, I got to get up there and deal with this issue. And there's another part of me that just said, oh, forget about it, I really want to sleep. But then there's the captain who slaps you, and and you kind of like you divide almost into different people as soon as you start cross the starting line. And he was talking about, as soon as you go across the finish line, those people kind of all come back together again.
Mm.
So that's part of an experience, I think, that's quite common for people who spend time alone in these kind of environments. But it's also common, especially in the early stages of a survival experience. Like, and I write about that in Adrift, for example, when the boat gets hit and it's filling up with water and it's going down, and there's a part of me freaking out and going, oh God, you're gonna die, you're gonna die. And there's another part of me telling you, shut the hell up, just wants to get rid of that guy.
Yeah.
And part of me that's acting in accordance with my practice and my training about what you need to do in order to actually bail out and get your equipment out, inflate the raft, blah blah blah. And there was even a part of me that was kind of amused because there was a camera on a video, no, well, not video, a Super 8 camera mounted on the aft deck, and somehow the electrical system had fused together or something and turned the camera on, which was taking this incredible footage, and there was part of me that was even like taking a little amusement at that. So there are all these things going on in your head at once, especially during a crisis period. And it's a basic theme of mine, both in life, especially after post Adrift, which has become a real theme of mine. Um, and certainly within the experience itself and through the book, is that we are not single dimensional people. We're multidimensional. When you're breaking up with a woman, maybe, let's say, take an example, there might be part of you that's like really sad about it and horrified, and there might be part of you that's actually a little bit relieved. And even it's difficult to talk to people about this during a critical time, but like, for example, I've known, I'm old enough now, a lot of my peers are gone. And my wife dealt with a lot of people in sort of end of life experiences and whatnot. And as much as you may be sad to see somebody go, you might also be relieved, both for them and for everybody around them. Some people suffer for decades. And so there's that mixed feeling there. And I think we're all like that, but both about what we think and what we feel. We tend to try to, I don't know, be single dimensional all the time, but I'm not sure why. I think it's less confusing perhaps, but I try to embrace all of those parts of myself. And I find it gives me a better sense of actual reality, not a reality I need to conjure in order to, you know, keep alive some belief that I need to believe or want to believe. And in fact, in the survival experience, of course, this is another theme of mine, is that denial is the number one enemy of survivor. If you can't come to grips with reality, no matter how uncomfortable it is or how it doesn't fit with what you want to believe, you kind of toast if you can't do that. Instead, the quicker you can get to grips with the exact nature of a problem, the quicker you can start to address how to fix that problem or how to compensate for it. And if you don't ever do that, then you can't ever even begin to find a solution or move forward. So I don't know if that answer
Yeah,
your
yeah, yeah.
question. I can kind of ramble a bit over
No,
these
no,
because these
no. I
things are
mean,
all connected.
it's a very, this idea that there are these like separate parts of you that break apart during this time when you're in survival mode and that come back together at the end of it. It sounds, I don't know. You said you were a
Can you hang on a minute?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
This phone's gonna ring, so I'm gonna just take a little break here for a second.
Okay,
Okay.
no worries.
Oh, it's never mind.
You're good.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't shut that ringer off. So if it
Don't worry.
rings, it rings. Okay. All right. So can you, I don't know,
Yeah, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know, carry on.
Yeah. um, so I was just curious. You said you were a child of the '60s, and that sounds like a very psychedelic kind of experience. Were you involved in that world at all?
Oh, I'm not sure how that world is. I mean, it was the world.
I see.
I was born in 1952, and sort of the beginning of the space age. Um, and the McCarthy era, I don't know, for a lot of your audience might not be familiar with that, but the country was freaking out about communists, and communists were everywhere, and it's not unlike what's maybe happening now, actually.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but the Cold War, I was in fifth grade when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. So I grew up with I literally grew up with duck and cover exercises, where they say they first of all, they take us into, and this was going back to, first grade or second grade, they show you this movie of, oh, here's the modern world, atomic bomb goes off, blows away, whole forests and buildings, you're familiar with the footage.
Yeah.
And then they tell you, well, if there's an atomic attack, get under your desk and put your hands over your head. And I was like, I'm a kid, but that doesn't seem to make much sense. Like, what's that going to be about? So we grew up in the era we grew up in, and then of course, by the time I'm in high school, early in high school, that was the summer of love in San Francisco. And in fact, I drove through San Francisco during, in I think it was 1967. And people are like, "Ooh, there's a hippie, there's a hippie." But it just shaped our whole atmosphere, our way of thinking. It was an incredible era because we were becoming cognizant more of issues revolving around civil rights, women's rights, all these things, which I think were and remain very worthy quests. And it was not only what was on the news, but what your peers talk about and what you personally try to incorporate into your own life. So that's when I say I'm a child of the 60s. It was really my formative years. I was really a teenager into my young adulthood. And of course, the 60s really stretched into the 70s and really kind of took a fundamental turn in the 80s, especially, Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and I think that was symbolic of a sea change in attitudes and less about how can we as individuals improve our culture into the sort of very individualistic viewpoint, which persists to this day of, what's good for me has got to be what's good for everybody else. And it's all about my rights and forget about responsibilities and things like that. So I guess that's what I mean in a general sense, but
I
I
see.
don't know. It's complicated.
Fair enough. I was curious. One of the things I didn't ask last time, but just the fact that when you immediately ended your time adrift, you were married at the time, correct?
That's right.
What was, maybe I'm forgetting, but at the last conversation, it wasn't as though like you got back onto shore and the first call was your wife or something like that. What,
Yeah.
and feel free to stop me at any time, but what was, were you were adrift at sea for 76 days, and was your wife concerned?
She was concerned, but to be honest, she was kind of caught in a very awkward situation. Frisha and I got married. We were quite young, and she had, I don't know, her upbringing. She was basically brought up by her grandparents because she was orphaned at a relatively young age, and that is a difficult thing for anybody. And so I think she felt quite lost for many years. She'd gone to a couple of schools and dropped out. She was really smart, really talented. But, she was kind of following me around. I was messing about in boats, and she loved boats. In fact, she worked at a very famous sail loft for a while and whatnot. And we both lived on a boat, and we really enjoyed the sailing. But then I think she kind of slowly but surely discovered herself and realized that what she wanted to do, so we came to Maine and bought a place, and she started organic farming and things and really developing her own life more. And that led to us basically kind of growing apart. We were um, intellectually very compatible in many ways, but also provocative to one another. And in the end, the basics of it was that she went back to school, and we were living apart, and she was really going in her own direction. And we had kind of decided, well, that's it, and we'll split everything up. And we weren't technically divorced, but we had actually been living apart for about 2 years before I left in Napoleon Solo. So when I was actually adrift, yeah, she was concerned, but a lot of people were expecting her to be sort of the mourning widow, if you will, and she wasn't there in her life, so it was very awkward for her, and I feel badly about like putting her in that position. But when I came back, even once I left a Napoleon Solo, I mean, it was like, well, the marriage is, technically we're married, but it's been over, and so I felt like that was part of the feeling of freedom for myself. Actually, we've been married for, I guess at that point, 5 or 6 years or something. And um, I felt free, as I'm sure she did, and which was a wonderful thing in many ways. But and I was glad in a way that I didn't have that attachment ashore. That there would be somebody who was like, really grieving and those sorts of things.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. So, in other words, what was there when you got back? Was there any like reunion with her at all? And I don't mean romantically reunion. I just did you encounter her after that?
Yes. Yes, 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 yeah, yeah, yeah. She was still around, and we had some nice discussions and nice walks. But and I hear from her every great while. It's not like it was an acrimonious kind of situation, us splitting apart. I still think that she was an incredible woman, and incredibly smart and talented, and she remains that way.
What was when you got back? One of the hardest parts of being done with this or of this journey, I would imagine, would be sort of like reintegrating into society because you're in this survival mode and then you're back in, you know, and you're laughing. So why is that? Why is that common?
I'm laughing because um, after Adrift came out, and nobody had asked me specifically that question until after Adrift came out, and I was doing a radio show with basically 10-year-old kids in New York, and this very precocious young man got on board and asked me specifically that, how long did it take you to reintegrate into society? And I was like, whoa. uh, um, I'm not sure if there is a definitive answer to that. It's a process that continues. I don't think we go through any experiences in life, and certainly not important fundamental experiences to our lives like that, without them continuing forever. Basically, we reintegrate them into our lives every day in different ways, and society overall, I don't know. I don't know if I was ever integrated into society. So that's one answer. But generally, I came back, made my way back to Maine. The guy I was working with who ran a boat design school very kindly offered me a job. And so I did that while taking time off on occasion to write Adrift. But it was a really difficult time, in very practical ways. I mean, I was broke. I had nothing. Um, I had nothing of value anyway. I had a old Datsun pickup truck with 150,000 miles or something on it that was so rusted out that I kept a piece of plywood in the floor so that when I drove over puddles, I wouldn't get completely soaked. Um, and so we were living. I had already been friends with Kathy, who is my wife now, and she also had gone through her own kind of situation, which I won't go into, but she found herself kind of alone and desperate, and we started living together in a house which has, Frisch and I bought initially, but she had gone off to this other life, and she was willing to rent it to us for $125 a month, basically because it was unrentable. A lot of it was unfinished. There were still holes through the walls, and I think that she put indoor plumbing in the house either when we first were renting it or shortly thereafter. But basically, it was about as rudimentary as a house as you could have, and we couldn't even afford the rent without living together. And so there I was, trying to survive ashore again. And a lot of people would have expectations. This gets back to, I guess, another question that you had about, I don't know, dealing with things afterwards. And, people calling, and, the press would call. And to be honest, even though I've been on both sides of this fence, as an interviewer and interviewee, the press can be a bit like sharks in a feeding frenzy. You know, they're all there and, oh, yeah, yeah, you're really important. I'm going to talk to you and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, they take you back into this, what is actually a pretty traumatic experience. And you're going through all these feelings again and whatnot. And they go, yeah, yeah, thank you. And hang up. And that's it, you know, and you're left kind of in a emotional, washing machine, and it can be really difficult after a while because everybody else is off, and you know they're living in California with their pools and you know all of that, and you're there struggling just to make ends meet. So it was a difficult period for, and we lived way under the poverty line for I don't know 4 or 5 years before I got Adrift published, and I remember actually when. Um, I found a great publisher and a great editor. I don't know how that happened, but it did. It was the right time at the right place, and something unheard of happened. Here we were struggling, you know, just to live, and oh, okay, fine, the book's going to get published, and Harry Foster, my editor, called me and he said, well, you know, we've sent out, you know, galleys and things like that, and we're getting a lot of really positive feedback. The publisher's really excited about this. And so we're deciding to, you know, kind of like increase the publication. And we're going to actually send you some extra money as an advance, which allowed us to finally go out and buy a car that actually worked. So and it wasn't a lot. I mean, I think the original advance was going to be like $2,000 or $3,000 or something, and they were going to give me a few extra $1,000. But in my world, we were living on like $5,000 a year, and I know this is ancient history, and $5,000 is a lot more than now, or a lot less now than it was then. But it was pretty close to the bone living in kind of a survival experience in its own right. So this reintegration into society takes a very, very long time, and if ever, but it's never complete. It's just you can't change the experience. You can't really you you can accept what's happened to you and kind of move on from that, but it's not something that ever completely goes away. I never forget the desperation of starving, of the appreciation for having, you know, a glass of water, stuff like that.
You still, every glass of water you get, still kicking it back like, here we go.
Yeah. Well, not exactly. I mean, we do fall back into bad habits, or not bad habits, but just kind of, you know, the way you were, you know, I bitch and moan with the best of them and stuff like that. But yeah, I have a consciousness of the preciousness of it. It's in the preciousness of, you know, times when you're just like existing without pain is, you know, anybody who's lived with a lot of pain at some point, I think they know what I'm talking about. You know, even though you don't remember pain, thank God, you remember what it was like to live in a lot of pain, or to starve, to be desperately alone, things like that. I know I won't forget it. I mean, that's why I'm talking to you now. I mean, if I was my old self, I'd be hiding in a corner someplace, probably. I don't know.
Just because you realize the being with other people after having been so painfully alone.
Yeah, and it's always a mixed thing. It's like the psychological splitting that we were talking about, or how you have different emotions. You know, I mean, people are both wonderful and horrible, as we all know. And I think what happened to me during the drift was that I came to better grips with that. Not perfect, and of course, it's not constant. You know, some days I'm totally fed up with humankind, but on a general level, I learned to embrace my own humanity and to have more empathy. As Kathy says, I opened myself up to the world. Um, so I wasn't so self-protective, and and which I hope I'm, you know, I'm not anymore. It doesn't matter who I am, or like I said, it doesn't matter what I am or who people think I am or what they think of me, really. Um, I'm less defensive in that way. I'm more open to people and realize the value of not only people in what they offer each other in the world, but just them for being them.
Steve, we're almost at an hour here, and I think that is just a perfect place to wrap up because I don't think we're going to top that. But um, listen, I again enjoyed talking to you. Um, I loved our last conversation as well. Uh, I definitely think because we were talking about earlier when you said we were talking about the fame and being known for things. Um, Clearly, it's had ripple effects beyond just the sensational aspects of the story. So I hope you're happy about that because I think a lot of people have taken your story and sort of um, it's a powerful narrative, you know.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And yeah, yeah, from the, I don't know, from the ridiculous to the sublime, perhaps. I think, there were some practical things. A couple of life raft companies, got in touch with me afterwards, and we made some small changes in rafts and things like that that hopefully will be better for mariners who are trapped in that situation in the future. But what has been very gratifying to me is to hear from people like yourself that the story of it, the I don't know, the ideas of it, have an impact, that are positive for people. It's made all the effort worthwhile. I'll tell you seriously.
And do you have anything like a website or anything like that you want to leave for people to find you?
Yeah, I have a website. Unfortunately, I've had a lot of personal health issues in the last 8 years, so it's way out of date right now. It hasn't been updated in probably 4 years or something. But there's stuff on there, a lot of connections, a lot of references, some articles, connections to the books, other people through the site. So people can look it up. It's stephencallahan.net. Um, and I think if people are interested in this documentary that's being produced, they can look at. I think it's called 76days.com or something like that.
Okay,
You can
perfect.
look it up, and if it's not right, correct it.
Will do. Steve, thank you once again for your time.
Thank you, Duncan, and best wishes to you and everybody over there.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Cheers.